They mocked her for being a woman, a quiet analyst assigned to a place that valued muscle over mind. So she knocked out the 5 Marines who embodied that disdain, not with anger, but with an efficiency that would change everything. The whispers about the spreadsheet lady would soon be replaced by a silence born of awe and fear. ####1. Arrival. The C-130 descended on a firebase Kestrel with a groan of stressed metal, kicking up a blinding plume of ochre dust. Elena Vance stepped onto the ramp, her small duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and was immediately assaulted by the oppressive heat of the Kandahar province. The air was a physical weight, thick with the smell of sun-baked earth, diesel fumes, and the distant, acrid tang of burn pits. The base was a study in grim functionality. HESCO barriers formed a perimeter around a collection of sand-colored tents and prefabricated buildings, all shimmering under the relentless glare of the afternoon sun. Men in faded fatigues moved with a lethargic economy of motion, their faces etched with a mixture of boredom and tension. Elena's arrival barely registered. To them, she was just another transient, another piece of administrative baggage delivered by the weekly supply flight. She wore simple khaki pants and a plain gray t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional knot. There was nothing about her that demanded attention. She was of average height and slender build, a stark contrast to the hulking figures of the Marine fast contingent stationed at the firebase. They were the base's Praetorian Guard, a unit defined by broad shoulders and swaggering confidence. PFC Miller, a young radio operator tasked with escorting the new arrival, met her at the bottom of the ramp. He was barely out of his teens, his face still holding a softness that this place would soon scour away. "Mung? Elena Vance?" he asked, squinting at his clipboard. "Just Vance," she corrected him quietly, her voice low and even. "Right. Welcome to Kestrel. Colonel Thorne's expecting you." This way, as they walked toward the command post, a group of 5 Marines were taking a break near the motor pool, ostensibly cleaning their rifles but mostly leaning against a Humvee, trading loud jokes. They were the unofficial kings of the base, led by a staff sergeant named Diaz, a man whose neck was as thick as Elena's thigh. He and his crew, Cole, Jackson, Russo, and O'Connell, watched her approach. Diaz nudged Cole, a smirk spreading across his face. "Look what the supply bird dropped off. They're sending us secretaries now. Au Cornell Shukled. Maybe she's here to organize our paperwork, Sarge. God knows we need it." The laughter was not subtle. It was a broadcast meant to be heard. It was a territorial display, a way of reinforcing the established hierarchy. Here, value was measured in physical strength and combat readiness. Elena's presence, in their eyes, was an anomaly, an administrative error. She gave no indication she had heard them. Her gaze swept over the base, not with the curiosity of a newcomer, but with the dispassionate assessment of an inspector. She noted the blind spots in the guard tower coverage, the way the fuel depot was situated too close to the ammo dump, the predictable pattern of the perimeter patrol. Her eyes cataloged everything, filing away weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Miller flushed with embarrassment. "Don't mind them, ma'am. They're Marines." Elena's expression didn't change. "I've noticed," she said, her tone giving nothing away. The single, flat statement hung in the air, neither a complaint nor a challenge, but simply a fact. She had seen men like them before. They were loud, predictable, and ultimately a liability. ###2. Dismissal. The inside of the command post was a welcome shock of cold air. Fans whirred in a futile attempt to circulate the refrigerated atmosphere. Maps, dotted with pins and scrawled notations, covered the walls. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood over a central table, a man whose posture seemed permanently braced against an ill wind. He had a face like a worn leather boot, creased with the anxieties of command. He looked up as Miller showed Elena in, his eyes flicking over her once before returning to his map. "Vance?" he grunted, not as a question, but as a confirmation of an inconvenience. "Logistics analyst." He picked up a thin folder from the table, her file, and flipped it open with a dismissive snap. Civilian contractor. Former DoD. It says here your job is to optimize supply chain efficiency and threat assessment integration. That's a hell of a mouthful of Pentagon nonsense. My job is to make sure you have what you need before you know you need it, Colonel, Elena replied, her voice maintaining its calm, level pitch, and to identify the threats that might stop it from getting here. Thorne finally gave her his full attention, but his gaze was skeptical, condescending. Ms. Vance, this is a forward operating base, not a corporate headquarters. We don't optimize. We survive. We have bullets, beans, and bandages. My threat assessment comes from a drone feed and men on the wire, not from a spreadsheet. He tossed the file back onto the table. You were sent here by some bean counter at Bugram, who thinks a new algorithm can win a war that's been going on for 20 years. You'll have a desk in the S for tent. Try to stay out of the way. Miller, get her settled. The dismissal was total. He had judged her, categorized her, and filed her away as irrelevant in under a minute. He saw her gender, her civilian status, and her non-combat role, and concluded she was a distraction. He didn't see the tension in her shoulders, the coiled stillness that spoke not of an office worker, but of a compressed spring. He didn't notice the way her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning exits, angles, and the people in the room. Yes, sir, Elena said, her face an unreadable mask. There was no anger, no frustration. There was only a quiet acceptance of the reality of her situation. She understood his perspective perfectly. It was the same short-sighted, tradition-bound thinking she had encountered her entire career. It was a system that valued the appearance of strength over the reality of it. As Miller let her out, she passed Diaz and his team, who were entering to give a report. Diaz met her eyes for a fleeting second, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He had seen the colonel's dismissive posture. He had been proven right. She was a nobody, a secretary. The message was clear, from the highest authority on the base down to the grunts on the ground. You do not belong here. ####3. Observation. The S4 tent was a cramped, chaotic space filled with stacked crates, the smell of canvas and old coffee, and the perpetual hum of a generator. Her desk was a folding table wedged between a pallet of MREs and a metal cabinet overflowing with requisitions forms. Elena set down her duffel, pulled out a ruggedized laptop, and began her work. But her work wasn't what anyone on the base imagined. For the first week, she adhered to the role she'd been assigned. She spoke to the supply sergeant, analyzed fuel consumption rates, and cross-referenced patrol schedules with ammunition expenditures. She built complex, elegant spreadsheets that no one would ever appreciate, tracking the logistical heartbeat of Firebase Kestrel. She became a fixture, a quiet woman tapping away at a keyboard, easily ignored. This was her cover. Her real work began when she stepped away from the laptop. Each morning before sunrise, she would walk the perimeter. She didn't jog for exercise. She moved with a slow, deliberate pace, her senses absorbing the environment. She memorized the terrain outside the wire, the dips and wadis that offered concealment for an approaching enemy. She noted the slight sag in the concertina wire on the western fence line and the predictable 2-minute gap when the guards in Tower 3 changed shifts. In the chow hall, she sat alone, but she was never truly by herself. She was listening. She listened to the gossip from the mechanics about the recurring engine trouble in the patrol vehicles. She listened to the pilots complain about the deceptive crosswinds on the northern approach to the landing strip. She listened to the medics discussing the most common types of injuries. It was all data, a mosaic of the base's vulnerabilities. Most of all, she watched Diaz's Marine team. They were a microcosm of the base's hubris. In the training yard, they were all explosive power and raw aggression. They practiced takedowns with bone-jarring force, their movements designed to intimidate. But Elena saw the flaws. Diaz, for all his strength, always led with his right side, leaving his left flank exposed for a fraction of a second. Cole, telegraphing his punches with a slight dip of his shoulder. Jackson's footwork was sloppy, his balance easily compromised. Russo and O'Connell were followers, their actions dictated by the pack leader. They were strong, but they were tactically unsophisticated. They were hammers, and to them, every problem was a nail. One afternoon, PFC Miller found her in the motor pool, staring intently at the undercarriage of a damaged MRAP. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, curious. "The shrapnel pattern is inconsistent with an IED," she said without looking at him. "The blast was directed upwards, but the fragmentation is lateral. This wasn't a pressure plate. It was command detonated from that ridge over there." She pointed to a low rise a kilometer away. The triggerman had a clear line of sight. "Your patrols are becoming predictable." Miller stared at the ridge, then back at the truck, his young face a mask of confusion. The official report had been a standard IED strike. No one had even considered a command wire. "How can you tell?" "Experience," she said, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were clear and direct, holding a depth he couldn't begin to fathom. "Patterns are everywhere, Miller. In logistics, in combat, in people. You just have to know how to see them." She walked away, leaving him standing there, a seed of doubt planted in his mind. The quiet analyst was seeing things the seasoned combat veterans were missing. She wasn't just counting supplies. She was counting seconds, angles, and mistakes. And at Firebase Kestrel, there were a lot of mistakes to count. ####4. Pressure. The pressure arrived in the form of a low, brown wall on the horizon. A shamal, the seasonal sandstorm, was bearing down on them. Within an hour, the sky turned a sickly yellow-orange, and the wind began to howl, a malevolent, shrieking entity that tore at the tents and forced dust through every conceivable crack. Visibility dropped to near zero. The world outside the wires ceased to exist. And with the storm came the inevitable consequence: communications failure. The main satellite uplink, battered by the gale force winds and sand, went dead. Colonel Thorne stood in the command post, his face a grim mask. They were blind and deaf. "What's the status on the backup?" he barked at the comms officer. "The primary dish is offline, sir. We've switched to the line-of-sight relay on Ridge 7, but the signal is weak and intermittent. The power unit up there must be failing. We're getting maybe one data packet in 10-inch. Ridge 7 was a rocky outcrop 3 kilometers outside the perimeter. It was a short distance, but in this storm, it might as well be on the moon. The trip was perilous, a perfect opportunity for an ambush under the cover of the storm. Insurgents loved to use the shamal to their advantage. "I need that relay online," Thorne snapped. "We're a sitting duck without comms." "Who's available?" The operations officer checked his board. "First and second platoon are still out on patrol, sir. Caught in the storm. We haven't heard from them in an hour. All we have is the fast team." Diaz and his 4 Marines stepped forward from the back of the tent. They looked eager, coiled with pent-up energy. This was the kind of high-stakes, high-risk mission they lived for. "We can do it, Colonel," Diaz said, his voice a low growl of confidence. "We'll take an MRAP, punch through the storm, swap the power unit, and be back before chow." Thorne hesitated. Sending a heavy MRAP was a noisy, obvious solution. It would advertise their movements to anyone listening. But what choice did he have? The panic was beginning to creep into the edges of the command post, a low hum of anxiety beneath the scream of the wind. The men were looking to him, and he needed to act decisively. "Fine," he said, nodding at Diaz. "Gear up. Take the South Wadi. It should offer the most cover." "Colonel." The voice was quiet, almost lost in the noise of the storm, but it cut through the tension in the room. Every head turned. Elena Vance stood at the entrance to the tent, her clothes and hair lightly dusted with sand. She had been standing there, listening, for how long, no one knew. Thorne's eyes narrowed. "What is it, Vance?" "I am Busse." "Your plan is flawed," she stated simply. A wave of disbelief and anger washed over the room. Diaz took a half-step toward her, his jaw tight. "You have something to say, spreadsheet lady." Elena ignored him, her focus entirely on Thorne. "The South Wadi is the obvious choice. It's the first place they'll expect you. An MRAP is loud, slow in this terrain, and its thermal signature will be visible to any half-decent optics, even in this storm. You'll be driving into a kill box. And what's your brilliant solution? Thorn asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A single operator, she said, on a light ATV, using the northern rock formations as cover, approaching the ridge from the blind side. Minimal noise, minimal thermal signature. Get in, swap the unit, get out. They won't even know anyone was there. Diaz laughed out loud, a harsh, barking sound. A single operator? Where are you going to send the cook? We're the only ones qualified for this kind of work. He gestured around at his team of giants. This is a job for Marines, ma'am, not for you. The insult hung in the air. The pressure in the room had found a focal point. It was no longer just about the storm or the failing comms. It was about pride, about the established order being questioned by an outsider, a woman. Thorn looked from Diaz's arrogant certainty to Elena's unnerving calm. His desperation was warring with his instinct, and his instinct told him to trust the muscle he knew over the mind he didn't. ####5. Intervention. My qualifications are not the issue, Colonel, Elena said, her voice remaining steady, a calm island in a sea of rising tempers. The mission's success is. Your team's approach is tactically unsound. Diaz's face darkened with rage. He stepped forward until he was towering over her. Listen here. We've been running missions in this shithole while you were probably color-coding binders. You know nothing about tactics. I know that arrogance gets people killed, she replied, not flinching from his proximity. The tension in the command post was suffocating. Colonel Thorn watched the confrontation, his mind racing. On one hand, Diaz was his best asset, a proven warrior. On the other, Vance's words had the cold, hard ring of truth. The South Wadi was the obvious approach. His own training screamed that it was a potential trap. Enough! Thorn's voice boomed, silencing the room. He rubbed his temples, the stress of the situation pressing down on him. He felt cornered, forced to choose between the devil he knew and a completely unknown quantity. He looked at Elena, a flicker of something, desperation, perhaps a sliver of curiosity, in his eyes. You think you know better, Vance? Prove it. Diaz smirked. How's she going to do that, Colonel? Beat us in a push-up contest? No, Thorn said, an idea forming, a way to settle this and re-establish order. A demonstration. Hangar 4. Hand-to-hand drill. You and your team, Diaz, against Vance. Standard CQC rules. No weapons. First to demonstrate a disabling technique on an opponent wins the point. 5 points wins the argument. A murmur went through the room. This was unprecedented. Diaz's grin widened into a predator's smile. This was his world. You want us to fight her? Colonel, with all due respect, we could hurt her. I'm not worried about her, Thorn said, his gaze fixed on Elena. I'm worried about my comms relay. Are you accepting the terms, Vance? Elena's expression remained placid. The terms are acceptable. The procession to Hangar 4 was silent and tense. The news spread like wildfire through the base. It was the only thing more powerful than the sandstorm. The analyst was going to fight the Marines. The hangar was a vast, cavernous space, smelling of oil and ozone. A few bare bulbs cast a sickly yellow light over the concrete floor. Diaz and his 4 men, Cole, Jackson, Russo, and O'Connell, fanned out, cracking their knuckles. They removed their blouses, standing in their tight brown undershirts, a wall of corded muscle and condescending smirks. Elena simply took off her thin outer jacket, revealing the same functional gray t-shirt. She stood in the center of the floor, her posture relaxed, her breathing even. She looked small, impossibly outmatched. You can still back out, Diaz taunted. No one will blame you. Let's begin, she said. Thorn gave a curt nod. Go. O'Connell, the youngest and most eager, charged first. He lunged forward, hands outstretched for a simple tackle. It was the move of a high school wrestler, all power and no finesse. Elena didn't retreat. She took one small step to her left, pivoting on the ball of her foot. As O'Connell barreled past, she dropped her body weight, her hand shooting out to cup the back of his knee while her other hand chopped down on the back of his neck. His momentum did the rest. He pitched forward, landing face first on the concrete with a sickening thud, out cold. One down. Silence. Cole and Russo exchanged a shocked glance and attacked together from opposite sides. Elena flowed backward, letting them commit. Cole threw a haymaker. She swayed inside the arc of his punch, her palm striking the nerve cluster on the inside of his extended arm. His arm went limp, a look of pure shock on his face. Simultaneously, she used her momentum to spin, her back leg sweeping out and hooking Russo's ankle. He went down hard, and before he could recover, the heel of her boot stamped down on his solar plexus. He gasped, the air driven from his lungs, and curled into a fetal position. Two more. The silence deepened. Jackson and Diaz, the last two, now approached with caution. The smirks were gone, replaced by grim focus. They circled her, tried to flank her. Jackson feinted high and lunged low for her legs. Elena didn't try to stop him. She leaped, planting one foot on his advancing shoulder and using him as a vaulting point. As she moved over him, she twisted in mid-air, her elbow descending like a piston onto the junction of his neck and shoulder. He collapsed in a heap, his body twitching. For down. Now it was just Diaz. The staff sergeant let out a roar of pure fury and charged. He was a bull, all muscle and rage. He threw a furious combination of punches. Elena moved like a ghost, weaving, parrying, redirecting. She wasn't blocking his blows, she was guiding them, letting his own energy exhaust him. He was punching at air, each miss making him angrier, sloppier. Finally, he overextended, throwing a wild right hook. This was the opening she had been waiting for. She flowed under his arm, her body pressing tight against his. Her left hand clamped onto his wrist, while her right slid up under his armpit, locking onto his shoulder. She torqued her hips. It was a perfect textbook joint lock. There was a sickening pop as his shoulder dislocated. Diaz screamed, a sound of agony and disbelief, and fell to his knees, clutching his ruined arm. 5. The entire fight had taken less than 90 seconds. Elena Vance stood in the center of the hangar, breathing evenly, not even flushed. She was surrounded by the broken, groaning bodies of the 5 most feared men on the base. She looked up at Colonel Thorne, her expression exactly the same as it was before. "The northern approach," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "It's the better plan. ####6. The shift." The silence in Hangar 4 was absolute, broken only by the pained groans of the defeated Marines and the incessant howl of the wind outside. The crowd of soldiers who had gathered to watch the spectacle stood frozen, their mouths agape. They had come expecting a joke, a quick and brutal humiliation of the outsider. They had witnessed an execution. It wasn't the violence that was so shocking, it was the method. It hadn't been a brawl. It had been a disassembly. She had taken 5 combat-hardened Marines apart with the detached, surgical precision of a master watchmaker. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, no anger. It was pure, terrifying efficiency. PFC Miller, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt a cold dread mix with a sense of awe. He replayed the 90 seconds in his mind, trying to process what he had seen. The way she had used O'Connell's own momentum against him, the almost invisible nerve strike that had disabled Cole, the fluid, impossible grace of her movements. It wasn't fighting. It was something else entirely. The mockery that had defined Elena's existence on the base was dead. In its place grew a new and powerful weed, fear. Men who had laughed at her a day ago now avoided her gaze. The whispers that followed her were no longer derisive. They were hushed, speculative, and tinged with a deep, unsettling respect. Colonel Thorne was the most affected. His entire operational worldview had been shattered on the concrete floor of that hangar. He had built his career on a foundation of established principles: strength in numbers, overwhelming firepower, and the unshakable superiority of a trained Marine. Vance had just disproven all of it with an economy of force that bordered on the supernatural. He stared at the scene, his face pale. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a profound and disturbing uncertainty. He looked at Elena, truly looked at her for the first time and saw not a civilian analyst, but a weapon of unknown origin and terrifying capability. "Medics," he finally barked, his voice hoarse. "Get in here. Get them to the aid station." He turned to Elena, his expression a complex mixture of shock and grudging respect. The condescension was gone, vaporized. "The ATV," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "It's in the motor pool. Keys are in it. You'll need a new power unit for the relay and a comms pack." "I'll need more than that," she replied calmly. "A climbing harness, 50 meters of ceramic fiber rope, a multi-spectrum optic, and the M110 sniper system from your armory, with 5 rounds of subsonic ammunition." Thorne didn't even question the list. A sniper rifle? Subsonic rounds? He had no idea what she was planning, but he was no longer in a position to argue. He was dealing with a professional whose expertise far outstripped his own. "Get her whatever she needs," he ordered the supplies sergeant, who scrambled to obey. As Elena turned to leave, Diaz, being helped to his feet by a medic, his face contorted in pain, looked at her. The arrogance in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else. The raw, humbled look of a man who has just come face to face with a power he cannot comprehend. Their eyes met for a moment, and in that moment a profound shift occurred. He was no longer the apex predator of Firebase Kestrel. He was prey, and he knew it. ###7. The second test. While the base hunkered down against the storm, Elena prepared for her mission with a silent, methodical focus that was unnerving to watch. She didn't rush. She moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had done this 100 times before. She field stripped and reassembled the M110 rifle, her hands moving with an intimate familiarity. She checked the seals on the replacement power unit and waterproofed the comms pack. She laid out her gear on a tarp: the rifle, the harness, the rope, a small toolkit, 3 bottles of water, and a single nutrition bar. It was a Spartan loadout, chosen for speed and silence. Dressed in dark, non-reflective gear, she wheeled the lightweight ATV out of the motor pool. The vehicle was little more than an engine and a frame, designed for reconnaissance. Its engine was a low hum, a whisper compared to the diesel roar of an MRAP. Without a word to anyone, she drove to the northern gate. The guards, who had heard the story from the hangar, simply opened it for her, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She slipped out into the raging sandstorm and vanished. For the next 3 hours, the command post was a tomb of tension. Thorne paced back and forth, his eyes glued to the static-filled screen that was supposed to show the relay status. He had staked the security of his base on a complete unknown. He had sent one woman into a deadly storm to do a job he had originally assigned to 5 Marines. It was either the smartest decision of his career or the dumbest. He replayed her list of gear in his head. A climbing harness made sense for the rocky ridge. The multi-spectrum optic would allow her to see thermal signatures through the dust. But the sniper rifle? The subsonic rounds? They were designed for stealthy, close-range kills, utterly silent. Was she expecting company? Did she know something he didn't? Just as the anxiety in the room reached its breaking point, a single green light flickered to life on the communications board. Then another, and another. "Sir, we have a signal," the comms officer yelled. "The relay is back online. Full strength." A wave of relief washed over Thorne. Moments later, the radio crackled. "Watchtower 3, this is Patrol 1. Do you copy? Over." The base was reconnected to the world. They were no longer blind. 40 minutes later, the ATV reappeared at the northern gate, a ghostly shape materializing out of the swirling sand. Elena drove it back to the motor pool, dismounted, and began methodically cleaning her gear. Thorne met her there, the wind whipping his uniform. "Report," he demanded, his voice tight. "The power unit was replaced," she said, wiping sand from the rifle's scope. "The relay is operational. Did you encounter any trouble?" Thorne pressed. Elena paused in her work. She looked up at him, her eyes holding the deep, impenetrable calm of a frozen lake. "There were 3 hostiles at the relay station," she said, her voice flat. "They were wiring it with explosives. I dealt with the problem." Thorne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. 3 hostiles. That explained the sniper rifle. She hadn't just gone to fix a machine. She had anticipated a threat no one else had seen, gone to meet it alone, and eliminated it without a sound. They won't be a problem anymore, she added, returning to her work. He stared at her, speechless. This wasn't a logistics analyst. This wasn't even just a highly skilled soldier. This was something else entirely. A ghost. A predator who moved silently through the storm and left only solutions in her wake. The second test hadn't just been passed. It had been redefined. ####8. The reveal. Colonel Thorne strode back to the command post, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Vance was no longer a name on a file. It was an enigma that threatened to unravel his understanding of the world. Who was she? Where did she come from? And who in their right mind would send a person like her to a backwater firebase under the guise of a logistics analyst? He sat down at his terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He pulled up her official file again. It was thin, professionally sterile. Elena Vance, civilian contractor, DoD Logistics Division. A few previous postings in non-combat zones. Germany, South Korea. It was a masterfully constructed fiction, designed to be plausible and utterly boring. But Thorne had commanded this base for 2 years. He had connections. He bypassed the standard channels and used his own encrypted sat phone to call a contact at the Pentagon, a 2-star general named Peterson with whom he had served in Fallujah. Marcus, Peterson's voice crackled over the line. This is unexpected. Is Kestrel still standing? For now, Thorne said, cutting straight to the point. I need you to look up a file for me. It's a civilian contractor. Elena Vance. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the faint sound of typing. Vance. Got it. Logistics analyst. Looks clean. What? Because she just took out 5 of my best Marines in a hand-to-hand drill without breaking a sweat, then went out alone in a sandstorm and eliminated a 3-man sabotage team with a sniper rifle. Her file is a lie, Jack. I need to know who I have on my base. The silence on the line was longer this time, heavier. When Peterson spoke again, his voice had lost its casual tone. It was hushed, serious. Marcus, you need to drop this. For your own good. She's there to observe. Let her observe. Observe what? Thorne demanded. I'm the commander here. I have a right to know who is operating under my watch. A deep sigh came through the phone. Marcus, you don't have the clearance. I barely have the clearance. Her real file is buried so deep in a black site server that trying to access it would get us both a one-way ticket to a windowless room in Leavenworth. Just give me something, Jack, Thorne pleaded, his voice low. A name. A unit. Peterson hesitated. Thorne could hear the internal struggle. This conversation never happened, the general said finally. Her name isn't Vance. That's a temporary designation. We don't know her real name. No one does. She doesn't belong to any branch of the military you've ever heard of. She was part of a unit that was officially denied to exist. It was called the Spectre Program. Thorne felt the blood drain from his face. He'd heard whispers of the Spectres, ghost stories told by intelligence officers after too many drinks. They were deniable assets, human weapons deployed for missions that could never see the light of day. They didn't exist on paper. They had no names, no histories. Her operational call sign, Peterson continued. His voice barely a whisper, was Wraith. Her file, the real one, lists solo incursions in Chechnya, deep cover operations in Iran, and a list of eliminated high-value targets that reads like a who's who of global terror networks. The reason she can predict supply chain vulnerabilities is because she spent a decade personally creating them for our enemies. She's not here to analyze your logistics. Marcus, she's here to analyze you, your command, your base, your vulnerabilities. They sent her to see if Kestrel is a functional asset or a liability that needs to be pruned. The line went dead. Thorne slowly lowered the phone. He felt cold, exposed. He looked out the window of his office towards the S4 tent. The unassuming woman inside wasn't an analyst. She was a legend, a ghost, an arbiter sent from the highest, darkest echelons of power to judge him. And he, in his arrogance, had mocked her. ####9. Respect. The morning after the storm, the sun rose over a world that had been scoured clean. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The oppressive tension of the Shamal was gone, but a new, quieter tension had taken its place. The Chow Hall was buzzing with the story. It had taken on the quality of a myth overnight. Some said she had moved faster than the eye could see. Others swore she had never touched the ground. The 5 Marines had been released from the aid station. O'Connell had a concussion. Cole's arm was in a sling from nerve damage. Russo had 2 cracked ribs. Jackson was suffering from severe vertigo, and Diaz's right shoulder was heavily braced, his arm completely immobilized. They were living, breathing monuments to her terrifying skill. Elena entered the Chow Hall at her usual time, got her tray, and sat at her usual empty table. But this time, the room did not ignore her. A profound silence fell over the tables as she passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Men lowered their eyes, not in disrespect, but in a kind of fearful reverence. She was no longer invisible. She was the most visible person in the room. She ate her meal with the same quiet focus she applied to everything, seemingly oblivious to the change she had wrought. Then, the main doors opened. Staff Sergeant Diaz walked in, followed by the other 4 members of his team. They moved stiffly, their bodies aching, their faces a mixture of pain and humility. They didn't go to the serving line. They walked directly, deliberately, toward Elena's table. The silence in the hall became absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Every eye was on the unfolding drama. This was the moment of truth. Would there be another confrontation? A challenge born of wounded pride. Diaz stopped a foot from her table. Elena didn't look up, continuing to eat her powdered eggs. He stood there for a long moment, the entire base holding its breath. Then, slowly, painfully, he brought his left hand up in a salute. It was not the crisp, perfunctory salute of daily routine. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply meaningful gesture of respect, a public acknowledgement of her superiority. One by one, the other 4 Marines followed his lead, offering their own salutes with whatever uninjured arms they possessed. They stood there, holding the salute, a formal surrender. Elena finished her bite, carefully placed her fork down, and finally looked up. She met Diaz's eyes, and for the first time, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acceptance, an acknowledgement. Just then, Colonel Thorne entered the Chow Hall. He saw the scene and stopped. He took in the 5 humbled Marines and the quiet woman they were honoring. He walked directly to her table, his boots echoing in the silent room. He didn't salute. He didn't apologize. He simply stood before her, his posture straight, his voice clear and devoid of any of its former condescension. "Ms. Vance," he said, using her name with a new weight. "My office. 10 minutes. We have a real problem to analyze." It was a complete capitulation. He wasn't giving her an order. He was asking for her help. He was finally acknowledging her true purpose, and in doing so, acknowledging her as his superior in all the ways that truly mattered. ####10. Closure. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The punishing heat of the day gave way to the deceptive cool of the desert evening. Elena Vance stood on the roof of the command post, a solitary figure looking out over the wire into the vast, empty expanse beyond. The base below her was different now. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet professionalism. Patrols moved with a new alertness. Guards stayed at their posts until their replacements were physically beside them. The small, dangerous habits born of boredom and arrogance had been excised. She had, without issuing a single order, fundamentally changed the culture of Firebase Kestrel. She had shown them their own vulnerability, and they had learned. The door to the roof opened, and PFC Miller stepped out, holding 2 canteens. He walked over and offered one to her, his movements hesitant, respectful. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, his voice quiet. She took it, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you, Miller." He stood beside her for a moment, looking out at the same horizon. He had 1,000 questions he wanted to ask, but he knew he didn't have the clearance for a single one of the answers. He finally understood that her world operated on a level he could never imagine. "The men," he said finally. "They call you Wraith now. They say it in a whisper." Elena took a slow sip from the canteen, her eyes never leaving the darkening landscape. "Names don't matter," she said. "Results do." It was all the explanation he was ever going to get. He nodded, understanding that he was in the presence of something far beyond his experience. "Good night, ma'am," he said, and left her alone with the sunset. She remained there as the last sliver of sun disappeared, plunging the desert into a deep, star-dusted indigo. She was a silhouette against the dying light, a guardian whose presence was both a comfort and a terrifying mystery. Her work here was almost done. The base was no longer a liability. She had analyzed the problem and implemented the solution. She was not mocked. She was not underestimated. She was Elena Vance, the logistics analyst. She was Wraith, the ghost. She was a quiet woman who had knocked out 5 Marines and, in doing so, had earned something more valuable than fear or obedience. She had earned a silence born of pure, unadulterated respect. And in the dangerous quiet of Firebase Kestrel, that was the only currency that truly mattered.